So this is the second part of my review of The Waves by Virginia Woolf. If you haven't seen my first video on the book, I suggest that you go and watch that one first and then come back here. It would make more sense. The links for that video will be in the cards above and also in the description below. In part one of my review, I shared with you my experience reading the book, which I loved and hated at the same time, which is very suitable for the characters and the themes of this book. We also talked about the structure of the book, the layout, the narrative style, and we touched a little bit on the characters in terms of their friendship and insecurities. In this video, I'm going to talk a little bit more about each of the characters separately, and then go over some of the themes that I found most prominent in this book, and finally conclude with a discussion of the waves, the literal waves of the sea. If you notice that the background is different, that's because I'm traveling, I'm staying with some relatives, and I do realize it's a week later, I have traveled and I'm still wearing the same shirt, but anyway, I hope the sounds in the background are not too distracting, but this is the only place that I could find that I could film in, and I really wanted to film this video and not miss another week uploading videos to YouTube. The first character we're going to talk about is Bernard, and Bernard is someone who is preoccupied with language and with the ability to make sense of the world through making phrases that describe things or sum up events. He is very good at it, even from a very young age. And for him, making phrases and writing them in a small notebook that he keeps in his pocket at all times, it's almost like a way of a life. Telling stories is a way of life for him. And for him, telling stories and making phrases that describe things which he keeps in a notebook that he keeps in his pocketbook, this is for him almost like a way of life. Also, Bernard has this curiosity about the life of others, and it is that curiosity that compels him to go on living. He sees someone standing in the street, and his mind automatically starts to wonder, who is that person? Who are they waiting for? What did they have for breakfast? What are they suffering? And through these skills, we find Bernard to be better than most of the other characters in this novel at getting along with social situations, social life, and people in general. And for him, life stops when he no longer has the ability to make sense of the world through language, when his ability to make phrases do not contribute so much to the experience that he is going through. And whenever his life is being shattered, even if momentarily, we see that curiosity about others being lost. And whenever that curiosity starts to return, we know that he is on the right track to rebuilding the pieces of his life together. However, as Bernard grows up, his faith in language and his ability to make phrases, we see it starting to waver a little bit. But we'll get to that later on in this video. One last thing I want to mention about Bernard is that Bernard is someone who is very comfortable absorbing and assimilating into himself different personalities, different people, and different identities. He often refers to himself as Shakespeare, as that character from a Dostoevsky novel, but most often he refers to himself as Byron. He really believes that all of these people are part of who he is, part of what makes him Bernard, and he's very comfortable with this kind of plurality of identities. So that was Bernard. The second character we're going to talk about is Neville. And Neville is someone who is looking for one person to pour his soul and life into. He just wants to concentrate all of his emotions onto that one person that can give meaning to his life. He falls in love with Percival, and we'll come to Percival in a moment. And for a very long time, Percival does become that center around which Neville's life revolved. Also, Neville is someone who he likes order, he hates chaos, and he wants to put everything into order. And perhaps that is why he likes the Latin language with all of its steely precision and very orderly syntax and grammar. And this is one more thing about Neville. Unlike Bernard, for whom language is a way of making sense of life, for Neville, language is something to be studied and enjoyed. He likes poetry, and he does become a successful poet. He becomes a very distinguished literary scholar as well. But for his longing for that one person in his life to give meaning for his life leaves him somewhat dissatisfied with his literary success and professional success. Also, perhaps because of his obsession with order, Neville does not agree with Bernard's views on multiple identities. For him, we are not an assortment of people. We are who we are because of the very peculiar ways in which, for example, we take off our coats, or the ways in which we spill coffee on a table when we are drinking it. It's those very, very minute things that make us very distinctly who we are. The third character is Louis. And Louis is an Australian with an Australian accent, and his father was a banker back in Brisbane, as we are told like a gazillion times in the novel. Louis makes sure or keeps repeating the fact that he has an Australian accent and that his father was a banker in Brisbane because he always feels like an outsider to the group. For him, class is a barrier, and he feels like an outsider because of his accent, because of the fact that his father was a working man. And he is aware of all of these things from a very, very young age. Even at the time when they were in the nursery, the teacher wanted them to pronounce certain words, and we hear Louis thinking that I'm not going to pronounce that word, I'm going to wait until Bernard says it and then I'm going to repeat it after him. He goes through that process of thinking because he wants to copy the British pronunciation to hide his Australian accent, and by extension hide his foreignness or his outsidedness, if that's even a word. He is very self-conscious about the fact that he comes from a lower social class, and he resents it. It makes him hate and at the same time envy the situation of his friends. Again, while we saw what language was for Bernard and for Neville, for Louis it is a matter of identity. He identifies himself as an outsider because of his Australian accent. He is also conscious not only about his personal past, but about the history of humankind in general. He keeps thinking about past civilizations and images from ancient times, and he feels like all of that history, the burden of all of that history, is weighing down on him. He becomes very successful career-wise, and he makes sure to let us know that he does become a very successful person. In an attempt, I see it as an attempt to overcompensate for his lowly origins, even though nobody cares and nobody sees his lowly origins except himself. So just like at the beginning he keeps telling us that his father was a banker in Brisbane, towards the end he keeps reminding us that now he is a very successful person in a very luxurious company, having very luxurious office and all of that stuff. But despite all of that, still his favorite places are places that are tied to his childhood and his lower social upbringing. For example, public houses and streets that are filled with factory workers and everything that is just associated with the lower classes. Now, those were the three male characters in the novel. Now we come to the three female ones. Let's start with Susan. And Susan is someone who loves nature, and I mean she loves nature. She hates restaurants, she hates schools, simply because she cannot stand the feel of the carpet, the tiles, the smell of furniture. Whenever we see her in restaurants or schools, she is always yearning to go back to the farm, to smell the flocks, to see the birds, and even to smell the trees. She is very obsessed with domestic life. In the beginning, we see her always missing her father and wanting to be with him. And later on in the novel, she marries, and her life revolves around her children. So her satisfaction with life depends completely on her being in nature, on the farm, with her domestic atmosphere, with her family, her children, or her father being there with her. And her satisfaction with life most of the time, and I say most of the time because there was this one very brief moment where she starts thinking if there weren't something more to life than all of this. But for the most part, she is satisfied with her life. And that satisfaction with life just casts a shadow over the situation of the other characters. There was one scene where Neville feels like all of his success becomes meaningless when compared to the content that Susan feels in her domestic atmosphere. One last thing about Susan is that in a sense she is also obsessed with possessions. Even her children become possessions that are to be collected at one point in the novel. So yeah, she wants to collect things. Her domestic life is made up of a collection of things. I'm not sure what that says about her character, but it's very, very obvious that she is someone who likes to be in possession of things. Next up is Jinny, and Jinny, I think, is the one who is most comfortable in her own skin and in her own life. For her, the meaning of life lies in what is physical. She is very conscious of her body and her beauty, and she uses those things to her advantage. She is often pictured as beckoning with her finger to some stranger who would invariably break off from a wall or from the group of people that he was hanging out with, and follows her beckoning. Unlike Neville, who is always seeking that one person to concentrate all of his emotions on, Jinny is seeking as many bodies as possible to interact with. She wants to dance, she wants to make love, she wants to seize the day. The main problem with this philosophy, depending mainly on her beauty and on the body, is that it cannot be sustained forever. Beauty fades and the body is going to wither, and this is what happens to her at one moment when she glances at a mirror and painfully realizes that if she were to beckon at a man at this moment, no one is going to break off and come to her. However, her response to that is still affirmative. She still wants to make the best of what she's got while she's got it, and do her best to keep enjoying life while still being grounded in what is physical. Now we come to the last of the 6 main characters in the novel, who is Rhoda. And Rhoda, I think, is the most difficult character to deal with because she is the most abstract. She is also the most insecure of all the characters. Like Louis, she feels herself to be an outsider to the group. But unlike Louis, whose outsiderness or whose foreignness depends on barriers in class and language, we do not see any significant reason why Rhoda feels like an outsider. She is an outsider simply because she is. It's almost like she can be identified as that eternal outsider. What defines her is the fact that she is an outsider. She does not feel like she belongs anywhere in the world. The way I came to think of her is someone who is not only depressed but also with an extreme, really extreme social anxiety. She hates human contact. She's terrified of crowds of other people, even when those other people is the group of her closest friends. Just to give you an idea, when she was coming into a restaurant to meet her friends, she circles around and tries to hide behind chairs and other people in order to delay that moment of recognition and having to face like her friends greeting her and recognizing her as much as possible. For her, that moment is terrifying. It's almost like a door being suddenly opened and a tiger just leaping at her. I mean, that's how extreme her anxiety is of coming into contact with other people. And this is an example where she feels that way with her closest friends. So you can only imagine how she would feel being with strangers, with the world at large. She is content with her solitude, and the word content doesn't really work here, but it conveys what I'm trying to say. I mean, she wants to be in her solitude, and she seeks refuge from the outside world in her head and in her imagination. We see her always having pictures or images of herself just flying into the desert, in empty spaces, or there is a puddle that cannot be crossed, or a bird that is dipping into a pool of darkness. I mean, these are the images that are constantly going through her head. Also, for Rhoda, nothing is easy. Something as simple as walking upstairs or wearing stockings, she cannot do that without being too self-conscious and very terrified of what she is doing. So that's why she is always looking at Susan and Jinny and trying to copy what they are doing. And to get back to those images that she has in her mind, I mean, what stands to me the most now looking back at it is that image of the desert with nothingness in it. It's as if her ultimate wish is just to vanish into that nothingness. Okay, so this was my impression of the 6 main characters, like what I felt to be the most identifying characteristics of each of them, or like the essence of each of these 6 characters. Now, there is a 7th character, which is a very important one in the novel, even though he does not get a voice, he does not say anything, and he is different from the 6 others in that he is not one of the main narrators, or not one of the narrators in the novel. And this one is Percival. As I have just said, Percival is the 7th character in this novel, and what sets him aside from the other 6 is the fact that he does not take part in the narration of the novel. He does not. We do not hear his own voice. We only learn about him and his actions and his thoughts. Not really his thoughts, just like his external situation from the other 6. Percival is handsome, he is strong, he does well in school, academically speaking, and he is also talented with sports. He seems perfect all the way around. Even his name smacks of something heroic, and if we are to believe the 6 other characters, he is a great person altogether. He was destined for greatness, he would be a great leader, he would do justice to the world and to a lot of people. And I say if we are to believe the 6 other characters, it's because it seems like these 6 people just idolize Percival. For Bernard, Percival is the hero of his stories. For Neville, he is the one person that would give meaning to his life. Susan believes that such a great person must be in love with her. Even Rhoda feels most solid, or least ghost-like, most grounded in reality when she is around Percival. Unfortunately, and perhaps inevitably, Percival, and don't worry, this is not a spoiler because the story and the book pretty much revolves around this incident. Percival dies halfway through the book. Now we're going to use Percival and the incident of his death and how the others react to it as a springboard to talk about the 2 main themes that I found most prominent in the novel, namely death and identity. Death is everywhere in the novel, from the descriptions of landscape and nature that is filled with images of decay and rottenness and death, to the minds of the characters who are very much obsessed with death, even from the time of infancy. At one moment, very, very early on, when the characters were still in nursery, Bernard and Susan venture a little bit deeper into the woods, and when they find themselves completely isolated from the world, the thought that comes into Susan's head is that if they were murdered here, no one would find out about their death. I mean, this is the ideas that are going through the minds of someone at a nursery. How old would she be? 4, 3, 5 at most. As they grow up, this obsession with death only increases, reaching its height with the news of the death of Percival, which forces each character to come face to face and to contemplate their own mortality. I mean, after all, now one of them is actually dead. They have to find ways to go on living knowing that death is just around the corner. Bernard, for him, he takes a break from making phrases and trying to make sense of the world through telling stories. Which, if you remember what I said about Bernard at the beginning of this video, it means once he gives up trying to make sense of the world through language and through making phrases, it just means that he plunges into nothingness. For Neville, who was perhaps hit the hardest by the death of Percival, he just cannot understand how life could go on indifferently and brutally, as if nothing happened. He also starts to seeing death just everywhere. A boy is trying to get on a bus and he says that the boy would just have to miss the step slightly and he would tumble and perhaps his life would be extinguished. Jinny as well experiences a moment of terror and fright as she realizes that her beauty will be withering and her body must be withering and that she cannot sustain her style of life forever. After the death of Percival, that realization that life can be extinguished at any moment becomes all too apparent and all too prominent all throughout the second half of the book. However, all of them, perhaps with the exception of one, manage in the end to find their own way of going on living with the knowledge that death can come at any moment. Following that journey as they grapple with their thoughts and these concepts, each in their own way, and in the end reaching that triumphant yet bitter end, it was very, very interesting to read. In the last chapter, which, as I said in the previous video, was dedicated completely to Bernard and his thoughts, in this chapter we see Bernard questioning everything, having lots of doubts about himself, about the meaning of life. He falters a lot, his will wavers, but with every stroke of doubt, something else resurfaces to give him hope and to give him strength to keep going on. And in the end, he looks death in the eye and just charges at it with all of his being. Identity, or the consciousness of who we are, is another very important theme in this novel. At the very beginning, all 6 characters seem to share some kind of a shared, blurry, similar kind of pool of identity that was just beginning to perceive the world and perceive their place in it. But even at that very early stage, there were some things that distinguished each of the characters. For example, Louis heard in The Sound of the Waves the sound of a beast stamping, as if symbolizing the violent resentment that will keep boiling inside of him for the rest of his life. What Jinny saw in the sunlight was a golden tassel, and all her life would be revolving around that golden moment when she, proud of her body and sure of her beauty, would beckon to a stranger to come to her, and they would always come to her in a moment that was described constantly in the book, or almost constantly in the book, in a golden atmosphere. Also, what is very interesting in the beginning is the way the narrators would pick up the thread of narration from one another. It was always done with some kind of a repetition, linking the two parts of narration together. For example, there is one scene where Susan breaks off crying and thinking some things to herself, and then Bernard's turn at narration comes and he picks up the same thread. He redescribes again the way Susan broke off crying and even almost guesses at what she was thinking. There are endless moments and instances like this one, as if suggesting that the 6 characters were developing their sense of the world and their sense of self in relation to one another, and those shared moments would bind them together forever, and they would keep revisiting those moments of childhood again and again and again all throughout their life. As time goes on, each character becomes more and more identified with their own set of struggles and their own ways of dealing with life. They even become identifiable through the images they use, the metaphors they repeat, and the patterns of thought that they keep engaging with. At points it becomes very easy to tell who is talking without even reading the actual name of the narrator. For example, is he or she very preoccupied with the past? Then easy, it's Louis. Are there endless images of deserts and dark pools and solitary scenes? Then it's Rhoda. Trees, nature, possessions? Then obviously it's Susan. Before we go on to talk about the way that the identities of these 6 characters define themselves in relation to one another and how they affected each other, I would just like to say one more thing about what I found to be a binding thing among all of the 6 characters, and that is language. In so many novels that use multiple narrators, we see that each narrator has their own way of speaking, their own narrative style. But in this book, everybody used the same kind of poetic, high-strung language. There was no way, if we take away what I've just said, the images that they use, the metaphors, and the things that are repeated, the patterns of thoughts themselves, we just look at the style of the language itself. There are no differences at all between, for example, Neville, who is supposed to be the very distinguished scholar coming from the upper classes, and Louis, the tradesman with a banker for a father from Brisbane, or even Jinny, the socialite, who is obsessed with beauty and the body. So how I came to think of the characters in this book is something like a river that was originally flowing with all of its waters in the same place, going in the same direction, in the same stream. And then it becomes divided into different strands, each meandering in its own way and in its own geography, becoming a distinct river in itself, but at the same time maintaining some elements of that original water that made up the original river. In the end, Bernard says that his life is not only his own life, but the lives of all of his friends together. It is not a single life, but it's made up also of the life of Rhoda and Jinny and Susan and Neville and Louis, all coming together in a knot that cannot be untangled. They are now part and parcel of who Bernard is. Now let's talk a little bit about how the identities of the 6 different characters interact with each other. As I said in part 1 of this review, all of these characters share a very extreme sense of insecurity, with some being more insecure than others, yes, but there is this kind of insecurity that binds all of them together. All of them share a similar anxiety about who they are and what makes them what they are. They have anxiety as well about their place in the world. And that anxiety increases whenever they are together, or at least thinking about each other in relation to one another. After a scene of mild conflict between Bernard and Neville, in which Bernard feels that he is reduced by Neville's way of thinking, Neville leaves and Bernard says that now he can feel those fugitive parts of himself that fled in the presence of Neville coming back to him to make him whole again. In a similar way, Susan, who is very content and satisfied with her life, in one scene she was sitting next to Jinny and she looks at Jinny's beautiful hands and starts thinking that Jinny now must be laughing at her own rough hands. And her content with her domestic life and her sense of self and wholeness just seems to take a blow at that moment. So there is this tension between being sure of who we are, which is most enjoyed in solitude and moments of loneliness, and that need for other people, that need for communion with our friends, which sacrifices something of who we feel to be when we are alone. It's like the price of that communion and oneness with our friends is an erosion of our sense of identity. It is like, okay, you want to be who you are, you want to feel secure within yourself, within your body. Okay, you can do that, but you have to do it on your own, alone. If you want to be with other people, to share your life with others, even those who you feel to be part of who you are, as I said, sharing significant moments of childhood and development together, then the price would be a loss in the sense of self that you have about yourself. The way Percival comes into all of this is that Percival, with his solidity, with his strength, and with his leadership, seems to represent the possibility of communion without any loss in self. Whenever Percival comes in, the characters who would be feeling very, very ghost-like, very non-existent, very non-present, suddenly become very, very solid, which is very important in this novel. They become very grounded in whatever reality they find themselves in. But unfortunately, and as you know, Percival dies halfway through the book, shattering any possibility of communion or unity between the 6 friends. From now on, each of them has to make his or her own way in life, sometimes coming together, sometimes going apart, sometimes whole and identifiable in solitude, and sometimes emerged and eroded in communion. Now, having said all of that, reading this novel felt at times like listening to an orchestra, not a very well in tune one, but one that is producing for the most part an agreeable sound. It's like the different members of this orchestra are of course not playing the same melody or the same tune, but they are playing different melodies that for the most part harmonize with each other. The sequence that is life, the band that is made up of all of the people and the cars and the lights and the landscape and nature and like the flow of everything just being connected, not in unity but in harmony, is something that is mentioned more than once in this novel. Now, to conclude, we cannot have a 30-minute worth of video talking about the waves without actually talking about the waves, the literal waves of the sea. I am sure there are many ways to interpret the significance of the waves in this book, not least perhaps in the way they add to the fluid, watery nature of the book. But for me, two things stood out to me the most. One, they are a constant reminder of the unceasing passage of time. The waves do not care that Percival is dead. They do not care about your personal struggles in life. They do not care that you are approaching death. They do not care about anything except constantly beating against the shore, just like time does not care either about any of those things. Just like the ticking of the clock would flick your life away second by second. Two, and I am not sure if this contradicts what I have just said, but the waves also seem to me to represent the perseverance of the characters and their willingness to keep going on and on despite everything that is going on in their life, and just to make sense of the world and to deal with it, with each character doing that in his own way or her own way and to the best of their abilities. Again, the waves will not stop breaking against the shore one after another, being part of the bigger body of water and wind, all part of the sequence. Exactly the same way that the characters would keep going on and on in their life, also part of the bigger flow of life. There is a phrase that is repeated again and again in this book that I think captures what I'm trying to say here, and it goes like this: life is pleasant, life is tolerable. Tuesday follows Monday, then comes Wednesday. So simple, but at the same time, if you get past the mundane feeling of that sentence, you can see how powerful and how uplifting and how life affirmative it is. God, I love this book. I was not sure about making this video. As I said in the beginning of this review, I had mixed feelings about this book, but I am very glad that I ended up making this video, because the process of collecting my thoughts and ideas and articulating them in a way that I hope is coherent enough for a video format has showed me how much I am in love with this book without even realizing it. It has like just opened different dimensions to this book that I did not know even that I found in there. And that's it. That's the end of this video and the end of this review. I hope you enjoyed it, I hope you found it useful, and let me know in the comments below what you think of this book. Do you think there is something else that I missed in my review? Or if you have not read this book yet, does it sound like your cup of tea? Does it sound like something that you would be interested in or not? Finally, if you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. If this is your thing and you're not subscribed to my channel yet, then please do consider subscribing. And finally, if you have been watching so far, thank you and cheers.